This is Newsroom. Hello and welcome from Johannesburg in South Africa. My name is Eben Jansen. The show is live. It's broadcast from our studios in Auckland Park. We're also streaming live on YouTube right now with the entire show available on our YouTube channel all of the time. Now, anti-apartheid journalist Nathaniel Nat Nakasa's remains has finally arrived home, and we'll be in Durban to talk about that just now. Then we look at freedom of expression, or the lack thereof, in Swaziland. We'll have a panel discussion shortly, and then we ask, finally, is there a link between poor construction techniques and oversight and tender irregularities here in South Africa? But that a little bit later. First, Katrin has the news of the day.
Well, hello and welcome to Newsroom. I'm Katrin Malan, and let's take a look at the top stories this morning. The Ekurhuleni municipality says no plans were submitted for the renovation of the house that collapsed in Meyersdal Eco Estate in Alberton, southeast of Johannesburg on Monday. 7 workers were killed and 8 injured. Rescue workers completed their search through the rubble yesterday. The National Home Builders Registration Council said yesterday that it will investigate. Arguments in the Democratic Alliance's application to have SABC Chief Operations Officer Claudia Motsoeneng's appointment declared unlawful will continue in the Western Cape High Court today. Legal counsel for Motsoeneng says the DA's application is premature and politically motivated.
The evidence that was forwarded to the public protector makes it clear that he had disclosed upfront that he did not have a matric certificate. And further, that he also didn't purge the employees that he's said to have purged. But all of these matters are matters that are being dealt with in front of the court.
The Reserve Bank has reassured South Africans that our banking system is healthy, reacting to credit rating agency Moody's decision this week to downgrade the country's 4 top banks. Moody's cut the rating of Standard Bank, Absa, FNB and Nedbank by a notch to Baa1. The Reserve Bank said it did not agree with the reasons given. The World Health Organization and the UN's World Food Programme are stepping up their campaign to ensure food deliveries to 1 million people living in Ebola quarantine zones. The death toll from West Africa's Ebola outbreak has now reached 1,229. Meanwhile, the president of relief group Doctors Without Borders has labelled the outbreak a complete disaster. And then the conflict in Gaza has flared up with renewed rocket fire and airstrikes as talks in Cairo aimed at forging a durable ceasefire in the 6-week war broke down. Israeli officials say dozens of rockets were fired from Gaza, the first of which were launched around 8 hours before the truce that was due to end at midnight. Hamas denied firing the first rockets. More than 2,000 people have been killed since fighting began. Now remember, all these top stories are available on our Newsroom Facebook page. You can also follow us on Twitter at SABC Newsroom. Eben, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Katrin. Now, anti-apartheid journalist Nathaniel Nat Nakasa's remains has finally arrived home. Nakasa's coffin was brought from the plane at Durban's King Shaka International Airport cargo section yesterday. Earlier in his career, he worked for publications including Drum Magazine, the Rand Daily Mail and Ilanga newspapers. He was forced to leave South Africa when the apartheid government refused to grant him a passport after he was awarded the Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Nakasa died after falling from a building in New York in an apparent suicide in 1965. He was 28 years old at the time. He was buried at the city's Ferncliff Cemetery. Now, from our Durban studio, we're joined by the convener of the Nat Nakasa Reburial, Mary Papaya. Good morning, Mary. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you.
Just tell us about the significance of yesterday, the arrival of Nat Nakasa's remains finally home.
Certainly a bittersweet memory for South Africa and the province as a whole. Nat played such an important role as an iconic journalist for the province and his family. It was a homecoming that came full circle to put to rest their last wishes of returning his remains back to his home. And for the media, it is a wonderful opportunity to recognize the role of an iconic leader, to recognize the efforts of an individual who contributed to our constitutional democracy. And certainly for our government, it has been an opportunity to recognize our heritage and honor an incredible leader, a man who was so young but who had so much to give and so much to aspire towards.
Now, the family has asked for this reburial to be a celebration rather than a period of mourning. How will this proceed?
What will happen going forward? Yesterday, Nat's remains were brought back, as you mentioned. It was thereafter taken to a mortuary in Durban, and on the 13th of September, the reburial ceremony will take place at the Chesterville Cemetery. There will be a memorial service, obviously, at the City Hall in Durban, and the final resting place is Heroes Acre at the Chesterville Cemetery in Chesterville, where Nat grew up.
Mary, we saw lots of pomp and ceremony yesterday upon the arrival. Just give us or put us in the picture as to the mood at yesterday's proceedings.
There was a sense of relief from most people there, certainly from the political leadership. It was a successful end to a long lobby. For the family, it was finding answers to questions that they had for so long. It was celebrating a life. It was bringing a loved one back home. It was a case of saying, what was Nat's last wishes? His last wishes has always been, I want to come back home. And that's what we saw yesterday. And certainly for the friends of Nat, people like the former press ombudsman, Joe Gowe, it was a case of we finally doing justice to who Nat was and what he was all about. In that sense, it was a celebration. There was elation, and there was a sense of finally a country, government working alongside civil society and the media to recognize and for a moment for the country to come together to say, what is it that we can do better in this democracy? How can we work together? And that's what we saw, completion of a mammoth range of tasks and work done by a range of individuals at all levels of government and in the media to bring back the remains of this iconic leader.
Finally, Mary, just take us through the person and journalist that Nat Nakasa was and what he stood for during his career as a journalist.
Certainly people will say that Nat was ahead of his time, a young person who had so much of wisdom. But for others, they said that Nat had a dream of a South Africa, of a rainbow nation that we all aspire to today. If you look at the Constitution, it talks about South Africa being a country for all who live in it. Nat spoke very profoundly of this when he spoke about his identity. He's been known as the native of nowhere, but he's come back home. And one of the things he raised in his identity was a culmination of aspects related to the history of South Africa. He talks about belonging to the wars of Cetshwayo, his identity being linked to the passive resistance of Mahatma Gandhi and that of the Great Trek. He talks about the mountains, the landscapes. That, in fact, is being surmised by experts as Nat foretelling what a rainbow nation should look like. And the sense from most people who knew him, who understand his works, and who've had time to study his works, is that Nat foresaw a country united by everything that is part of our history and our heritage. He certainly was a formidable, iconic leader who wrote very thoroughly and very profusely about what he thought, what he saw, and what he envisaged.
Thank you very much for joining us today live from Durban. That is the convener of the Nat Nakasa reburial, Mary Papaya. And just to recap, the remains of pioneering South African journalist Nat Nakasa has arrived home. The coffin arrived at King Shaka International Airport in Durban yesterday. Nakasa died at the age of 28 after falling from a building in New York in an apparent suicide in 1965. He was buried near American human rights activist Malcolm X at the Ferncliff ceremony in the city earlier this week. Arts and Culture Minister Nathi Mthethwa led a delegation to the United States to bring back Nakasa's remains. Time now for a look at what's on social media, or what you're talking about on social media at SABC Newsroom. That's where you can interact with us, and that's where you can send us your contributions. Now, first up, Sihle Ndebele says Nat Nakasa was an inspirational journalist. His remains have arrived in Durban for proper and dignified burial. Moloisi says we welcome Nat Nakasa home about that alleged suicide. ... Kathleen Davids, the late Nat Nakasa died long before hitting the ground. Imagine the possibilities for South Africa if it hadn't lost its big black brain box. Says there we have a lovely picture of Nat Nakasa. Welcome home, Nat Nakasa. Your wish has been granted. Home at last. Thanks for the memories. That from Daniel Kenya. Time now for us to take a look at the front pages from around the world today. In the US, the Wall Street Journal reporting on a march held in the Ivory Coast that raised awareness of the Ebola outbreak. Then we go to Latin America, where papers there are looking at the latest in Gaza as fighting has resumed with the collapse of truce talks. And the Sydney Morning Herald there with a picture of a woman clinging to her umbrella as heavy rains continue to cause havoc across Sydney's metropolitan area. You're watching Newsroom on SABC News. We'll be back after a short commercial break.
Have we seen the last of you in politics?
I don't know. No, I'm just okay now with the work that I'm doing. Let me just do one thing at a time. So I don't have any plans for politics.
Watch Question Time with me, Mpho Tsedu, Monday to Thursday at 5:30 p.m. on the SABC News Channel.
Molweni, nda, dumelang, assalamualaikum, namaste, goeiemorgen, Jumbo Africa, and a very warm welcome to AM News here on SABC News Channel 404. The Basic Education Minister, Angie Motshekga, has dismissed the renewed Limpopo textbook saga as a storm in a teacup.
They have to collect books the previous year. And it's actually the very principals, if that's what they told me was true, there'll be ill discipline, because they were supposed to have collected books so that state doesn't buy books because you don't buy the same books every year. A book is supposed to last for 3 years. So they are supposed to collect them so they don't run short.
That's AM News, daily at 10 a.m. on SABC News. SABC News, we've got Africa covered.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsroom on SABC News. Last month, we brought you the story of human rights lawyer Thulani Maseko and newspaper editor Beki Makubu, who were both convicted of contempt of court and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment without the option of a fine even. This after they were arrested in March on charges of scandalizing the judiciary and contempt of court following the publication of an article they had written criticizing Swaziland's judicial system. The case has brought questions of freedom of expression in Swaziland back in the spotlight, and many feel it highlights the lack of respect for this basic human right in that country. Now, to further this discussion, we have a full house. In the far corner, we're joined by Professor Anton Harber, Chairman of the Freedom of Expression Institute here in South Africa. We have the former editor of the Swazi Observer, Musa Ndlanga Mandla, and from the Southern Africa Litigation Centre, project lawyer Carolyn James. Before we talk, very good morning first, but before we start the discussion, we spoke to the wife of Becky, who was imprisoned with Tulani. We interviewed her and asked her how life has been without a husband. Here is a bit of what she had to say.
Anyway, it has not been easy, but we are coping. We have to be strong. We all have to be strong. I have to be strong. The children have to be strong themselves, you know. Yeah.
And how do you think the kids are coping with the situation?
Well, there's a 9-year-old, I gave him newspapers.
Well, we apologise for that, just sort of fell out there, unfortunately. But let's carry on with the discussion on this very important issue in Southern Africa. If I can start with Musa first. Musa, you're the former editor of the Swazi Observer and probably the perfect man to give us a little overview on what has happened in this case. It seems a little bit absurd, even the charges, scandalising the judiciary in this case by journalists. What do you make of it? And just give us a little bit of background, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. As you have said, I'm former chief editor of the Swazi Observer. I was fired and I had to flee Swaziland after we didn't see eye to eye with the authorities regarding issues of human rights and democracy, and also featuring some of the human rights leaders in a newspaper that is known to be a state newspaper. But coming back to this case, the case of Bheki Makhubu and Tulani Masego, the human rights lawyer, is a very sad one indeed, because it shows just how far the Swazi regime is willing to go to stifle freedom of expression and to stifle any attempts at pushing for democracy in the tiny landlocked country. These are two innocent people who are in jail as we speak for questioning why things were done in the wrong way that they were done. So you have two innocent people in jail.
Professor, the Freedom of Expression Institute, you're well aware of what's been going on the last decade or so in Swaziland. What are your views on this particular case? And then if you can maybe give us the sort of broad strokes that you're thinking about Swaziland within the context of Southern Africa.
I think it's absolutely horrifying. I think that all journalists must be horrified. These are people locked up just for doing their job. Really, if you look at what they did, what they reported, what they wrote, what the journalist involved wrote, it was absolutely routine. There's just no justification. And it just shows an extreme intolerance for any level of critical thought, independent thought, any interest in democracy in Swaziland. It's absolutely horrifying.
Carol, if I can come to you, sort of the legal aspects of this case. These two gentlemen, they're facing, some say up to 2, others up to 3 years in prison now. What is the outlook for them?
I think the outlook is quite bleak. They are going to appeal the conviction and sentence, but I think the Supreme Court of Appeal is unlikely to change the conviction. If anything, they may reduce the sentence, but by the time the case is heard on appeal, there's a good chance they'll have been in detention for a year, maybe more, and so they will have been punished for having written these articles anyway.
Professor, could we have done more in South Africa? It almost seems as if all media houses, including our National Editors Forum and so forth, it seemed as if we jumped a little bit late onto the bandwagon of this specific case. Or is it a scenario that it is almost a little bit out of heart, out of mind?
Certainly we could have done more, we can do more, and we should do more. First of all, we have to report on it fully to make everyone aware of what's happening in Swaziland. South Africa has influence, great deal of influence, maybe decisive influence over Swaziland, and I think that influence should be exercised to try and rectify the situation.
You've been on the ground in Swaziland. Is it as simple as South Africa exercising their influence over King Mswati and his band of merry men, as it were?
Indeed, as Professor is saying, South Africa has a big role to play. Swaziland is an immediate neighbor, and over 90% of our imports and our livelihood comes directly from South Africa. And we know the power and the reach of the South African media. We have seen very serious national stories, national decisions being reviewed, being taken seriously after the media in South Africa had taken a stand. And the South African media really has protection of laws. You have your laws of access to information, and you have laws that really push freedom of expression. So yes, Swazi journalists, on the other hand, do not enjoy the kind of freedoms, even though they are written in the Constitution of Swaziland, but they are not guaranteed and they are not practiced. I make an analogy of dealing with drug dealers. If you want to really stem the tide regarding drug dealing, you go for the big fish. You go for the big people who are really supplying these drugs, not just the small ones selling them in little pockets. So what they have done with the Bheki Makhubu issue, I know Bheki personally, he's a friend, and Bheki is fearless, and Bheki will go to all lengths to get that story, to get those answers. And now what the Swazi regime has done is to say, if we're going to put the fear on all journalists and to teach them where they should be, we should deal with Bheki Makhubu. So this is not just about Bheki Makhubu, it's about every journalist in Swaziland. And today, as we speak, journalists are very scared to talk about issues that are affecting the people of Swaziland. And it's a tragedy.
Professor?
If I can add that this isn't just about the rights of journalists and about freedom of expression. It's about the ability of Swaziland to deal with its issues, to deal with its serious HIV/AIDS issues, its serious poverty issues, because if you don't have an open debate and discussion about what needs to be done to fix the country, then it's very hard to be positive about the country. So it's a very broad and very wide and very significant issue.
I'd like to come back to that point just now, but I'd like to first conclude about these two gentlemen that are now in prison. Could they have approached this case a little bit differently? We have reports of them being quite strong in their stance in court and quite tough with the judge about their rights, and this in a way worked against them and led to what everyone sees as quite a harsh sentence.
I think that both Tulani and Bheki realized as soon as they found out which judge had been allocated to preside over the case that there was very little chance of them getting a fair trial. This is a very new judge to the bench. He's only been appointed recently, and there have been questions over the rationality of his appointment. He's seen as the Chief Justice's stooge. And I was present in some of the court hearings, and his approach towards them was incredibly hostile. There were instances of him not taking notes when the defense attorneys were speaking and rolling back in his chair. And I think Tulani and Bheki realized that this was an opportunity for them to make their voice heard because there was no other way for them to do it. And they took this court case as that, knowing that the judge was not going to hear their case fairly.
Well, that's very interesting. Professor, I'd like to come back to you and talk about freedom of expression, one of the pillars of democracy. Swaziland, though, is not a democracy.
Well, that's the root of the problem, isn't it? You have an unaccountable leader, and clearly things are going wrong. And if you can't openly discuss and canvass alternative approaches, needs for democracy, needs to implement their own constitution, needs for an independent judiciary to deal with these things properly, then I'm afraid the country is on a pathway to nowhere.
Our president, under apartheid, lived for many, many years in Swaziland, and Swaziland was one of the pillars that supported the ANC at that time. Does this not mean that we might, politically, we might have the ear of the king and that reform could come through that sort of avenues?
Yes, correct. A lot of Swazis sacrificed their freedoms. Some paid the ultimate price when the apartheid state apparatus descended on cadres, especially ANC cadres, who had found refuge in Swaziland. And so it is not asking too much of the government of South Africa, of the leadership in South Africa, to take a more proactive interest in what is going on in Swaziland, in assisting the people of Swaziland tell their story, move forward to democracy, move forward to self-determination. And it's not just about South Africa being a neighbor. We know that the world is awash with other areas of conflict, areas of problems. But, you know, Swaziland is just 45 minutes away from South Africa.
Yeah.
And, you know, the people of Swaziland are really stifled. There's no democracy there. And just not democracy, life itself is terrible, just in a neighbor next door. So, yes, we do plead and ask South Africa to take an interest in Swaziland.
Caroline, let's move to the case. How do you see things proceed for these two gentlemen? Do they have any rights to appeal? What kind of rights do they have? And if you can maybe give us an update as to their mood and their position in prison right now.
They do have the option to appeal, and I think that they will appeal to the Supreme Court of Appeal in Swaziland. They have also got some sort of international options. I know that there has been an attempt to approach the UN Human Rights Commission, and there is also the possibility of going to the African Commission once the Swazi instances have been exhausted. When I last saw them in court, they are very positive. They do see themselves as prisoners of conscience. They see themselves as being able to use this as an opportunity to speak for the many Swazis who don't have this opportunity. And so I think that they believe in the cause and they believe in what they're doing, and that is giving them strength and their families strength. But to be imprisoned for months on end with no real idea of when it's going to end is very distressing for them and
for
one
their
would
families. Think in quite tough conditions as well.
Yeah.
Professor, if I can widen the discussion a little bit, we just had a SADC meeting hosted by Zimbabwe at Vic Falls the last couple of days. 5 of the countries, the SADC members, are accused of stifling the press in their countries. Is it not just a problem that permeates not just in Swaziland but throughout Southern Africa, where we need to maybe take a harder look at freedom of expression and the like?
Well, it varies from country to country. There's some countries that have become and are becoming more open, and there's some that are on another path. But I think it's clear that the SADC view, the AU view, is for freedom of the press, is to open it up. And I think a firmer line needs to be taken to encourage countries like Swaziland to come along on that journey.
What about the role of the people of Swaziland? In the end, if people are so unhappy as we make them out to be, surely they will rise up, and part of that responsibility should be with the people of Swaziland, or is it culturally not acceptable in Swaziland?
Indeed. The people of Swaziland right now are too busy trying to survive. And also, the Swazi regime has used witchcraft, has used culture, and is even using religion to stifle, you know, the people and the people's expression for to aspire to what they deserve. Just now, there is talk that the Swazi regime is organizing 1 billion rand to build a church. And yet, when you go to Swaziland, there's a church in every other street corner. And you wonder, why would you want to mobilize so much resources, 1 billion rand, to build a church that will accommodate 30,000 people when we don't have adequate hospitals, when students right now, there might be a strike in the University of Swaziland because there are no scholarships. Where are we taking the country?
Churches make money, sir. Newspapers don't. Professor, final remarks to you this morning. Just wrap it up for us, if you can.
I think we in South Africa really need to call on our government and our authorities to take up the issue with Swaziland in as strong a way as possible and put pressure on them to rethink the path they're on.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us this morning on this very tender topic here in Southern Africa. It's a story that people don't really like to talk around in an official capacity. We've learned over the last couple of weeks. But thank you for this lovely panel discussion this morning. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Of course, that's the discussion around human rights lawyer Tulani Maseko and newspaper editor Beki Makubu, who've both been convicted of contempt of court and scandalizing the judiciary in Swaziland. They're facing up to 3 years in prison, it seems. Send us your views at SABC Newsroom. We'd love to put it up. There you have it. Beatrice Mahonga says, it appears to be an emotional discussion after the Ambrosini death. No marijuana, go to Sterkfontein and see the effects of cannabis. So that, of course, is a discussion that we had yesterday. And I can tell you it was a very passionate one. It was indeed. We had a lady that simply said, no to cannabis. Future CEO says, such a great debate. So hard to find the middle ground on these issues. Yes, I agree. Denver Damon says, Mapanga is just straight out ignorant and without knowledge. I'm not for legalizing dacha, but this lady needs information. Others invited her to use some of the substance so that she could calm down on Twitter yesterday. I caught the tail end of the heated debate on SABC Newsroom on decriminalizing drug use. Well, you can go online on our digital platform. That's where we have it all the time. Devon Harmer says, at least the lady from Concerned Young People of South Africa and her passionate yet uninformed opinions provided me with a good laugh this morning. That was very much the sentiment that was doing the rounds yesterday. Let's take a quick look at what's happening on our Facebook page. Of course, that's where you can get all the latest updated stories. We try and keep them alive there. Today you will see that government says it has designed a special 6-month program aimed at escalating levels of drugs, alcohol and substance abuse in the country. You will also see Hamas militants in the Gaza Strip have fired rockets at Israel for a second day today after fighting resumed with the collapse of truce talks. And police say they're still monitoring the situation in Rivoli, south of Johannesburg. Protesters in the area are calling for local DA ward councillor to step down. All of those stories and more on our Newsroom Facebook page. Now, yesterday we received that huge response on social media sites to our interview of legalizing cannabis with our guests from the Concerned Young People of South Africa and Below the Line, the lobby group. If you didn't see it, here's a sneak peek of what you missed. If you look at the trials that have gone around the world, yes, it's legal in quite a few states in the US and so forth. What do you say to that?
You know what, to conclude this, the legalization of dacha is a no to our country. Look at the rate of rape in our country because of people that
But you can't say dacha makes people
that are under the influence of dacha. Look at criminality because of the people that take dacha and then end up committing those crimes.
I don't think,
William,
I think that would be a very uninformed view if you say that dacha causes people to rape and people to be involved in crime. I would rather say that alcohol that's freely available out there makes people much more aggressive than dacha.
From experience.
What experience then?
I've got so many boys, as I've said.
No, that's a generalization. What experience?
It's fine. Above 2,000 of them. They have been
One
involved.
Specific case. They
have been involved with dacha. They come to us and testify that because of dacha, this and this is what I've done. Those people have been involved in the worst criminal cases.
But surely you can't blame. Surely you can't blame.
It is
you can't blame. It's a drug, but so is sugar. Sugar is a drug. More people on the planet today are addicted to sugar and kills more people.
Sugar is more healthier, but dacha is.
I once saw a flower blossom through 27 prison bars of yesterday's unjust flames. I felt an old woman's anticipation for the country's first open elections. And I heard the loud celebrations of that flower's historic inauguration. I was there when Unity sang of how the Springbok never held anything back, and we saw a first-time band of 11 men, Shibobo possibility throughout the land. At the foot of Africa, time remembers how truth can reconcile a people. We carved our name into space, and on the world stage, our art stood united. When we blow that vuvuzela, the whole world goes into a trance. And even in that tearful hour of the flowers' separation, we are a people who see the music and hear the flowers dance. SABC, sharing 20 years of inspiration.
Well, hello and welcome back. I'm Kathryn Malan, and let's take a look at the news making headlines this morning. The Reserve Bank has reassured South Africans that our banking system is healthy, reacting to the credit rating agency's Moody's decision this week to downgrade the country's 4 top banks. Moody's cut the rating of Standard Bank, Absa, FNB and Nedbank by a notch to Baa1. The Reserve Bank said it did not agree with the reasons given. The Ekurhuleni municipality says no plans were submitted for the renovation of the house that collapsed in the Meyersdal Eco Estate in Alberton, southeast of Johannesburg on Monday. 7 workers were killed and 8 injured. Rescue workers completed their search through the rubble yesterday. The National Home Builders Registration Council said yesterday that it will investigate. The World Health Organization and the UN's World Food Programme are stepping up their campaign to ensure food deliveries to 1 million people living in Ebola quarantine zones. The death toll from West Africa's Ebola outbreak has now reached 1,229. Meanwhile, the president of relief group Doctors Without Borders has labelled the outbreak a complete disaster. The conflict in Gaza has flared up with renewed rocket fire and airstrikes as talks in Cairo aimed at forging a durable ceasefire in the 6-week war broke down. Israeli officials said dozens of rockets were fired from Gaza, the first of which were launched around 8 hours before the truce was due to end at midnight. Hamas denied firing these rockets. More than 2,000 people have been killed since the fighting began. Now remember, all these top stories are available on our Newsroom Facebook page. You can also follow us on Twitter at SABC Newsroom. Eben, over to you.
Now, this week we were shocked by yet another building collapse that claimed the lives of no less than 7 workers in Alberton, south of Johannesburg. Last year, the Tongaat Mall collapse made national headlines when the roof of the mall collapsed, killing 1 person and injuring a further 29. A case of culpable homicide was opened at the time. Both incidents raised questions about construction and construction management here in South Africa. Now, to shed some light on construction management in South Africa, we are joined by the President of the South African Council for Project and Construction Management Professions, Mr. Eric Manchidi. Good morning to you, sir, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Many people think it's so simply putting bricks and mortar together and construction gets underway, but there's a lot more to it. Just give us a little insight into the work that you do, sir.
Well, thanks. The South African Council for Construction and Project Management Professions is a statutory body that has been established in terms of Act of Parliament, Act 48 of 2000, under the Ministry of Public Works, and is responsible for regulating construction management and construction project management professions in the South African construction industry.
Do we have a lot of unscrupulous construction companies and building professionals in South Africa that we have these incidents periodically, or are these the exception rather than the rule?
Well, our responsibility is to ensure that the public get protected against such poorly trained, unqualified construction managers or construction project managers to avoid issues like that. As part of our responsibility, we have been given a mandate by the Department of Labor to register professionals in construction health and safety. Hence, in the future, the construction health and safety agents, managers and officers will be regulated through registering with the council.
I wanted to ask you your views. On screen now we see pictures of this house that collapsed and seven workers died in Alberton. What are your views on this specific case of this week?
First, I pass my sincere condolence to the families who have lost their loved ones. It is an unfortunate incident, and as you are well aware, the Department of Labour is busy with the investigations, and once they have completed the investigations, one will be able to make the necessary comments.
Now I want to ask you a question that I feel is an important one in this context, and a question that a lot of our viewers are asking and so forth, and the connection is being made. Is there a connection in South Africa between tender irregularities and poor workmanship and poor construction?
Well, yes, there is, in the sense that construction activities have got to be executed by a qualified person. And what do we mean by a qualified person? In this particular case, our council is responsible for ensuring that construction managers are competent and licensed to practice on construction projects. The same applies with respect to construction project managers. Mm. And the council has got a code of conduct of which registered members do subscribe to, of which amongst others it addresses those elements of irregularities. Should any of the registered professionals be found guilty of such events, then the council has got the responsibility to charge that individual after proper investigation, of course.
And what kind of powers do you have? What kind of fines or punishments can be meted out to people, especially if people lose their lives?
It can be as harsh as taking away the individual's license to practice, therefore not being allowed to practice the professions which we are regulating in the South African environment.
Well, that's the president of the South African Council for Project and Construction Management Professions, Mr. Eric Manchidi. Thank you for joining us and giving us an insight. We're going to continue this discussion, but let's have a look at your views on this specific incident that happened this week when 7 workers lost their life. Of course, there was also the Tongaat Mall. Let's just have a look at your comments and see what are the things that you are passionate about. Now, Sam Mhlungu says, shocking stuff about the 8 deaths on the Eco Estate construction site near Alberton. Then Sam Mahlase, he says, OHS Act state that the employer has to provide the working environment that is safe and without risk to the health of employees. Hashtag Alberton, he says. Lioness says, luckily I left early. It's not only all about you, Lioness. Some people lost their lives, my dear. Have a little bit of respect. There we have a picture of that faithful place, the house that collapsed. 7 workers lost their lives. Look local, that's a picture put up by them on that scenario that played out in Alberton. A real tragedy it was. Now, we continue this discussion, just widening it. All too often, we hear about corruption and tender irregularities robbing the country of billions and billions of rands. Shoddy workmanship and changing of procurement documents to meet the tender requirements are far too common. And unfortunately, in the end, people pay with their lives, as we've seen. All hope, however, is not lost. Open Tenders is an online platform that aims to add transparency in the procurement processes in obtaining tenders. Open Tenders is an online platform that provides small and expanding firms with access to public and private sector procurement. Now, to tell us more, we are joined by Open Tenders CEO Sivo Makungu and Chairman Madoda Kuzwayo, who is with us this morning. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Mouthful, I've said there, but if I can start with you, sir, just give us a brief overview of your goals and your aims, and how do you make the world better for those in business?
Well, first, what we want to be able to do, Eben, is to make sure that tendering is transparent and accessible to all entrepreneurs. And the way we do this is, one, by offering an online platform which everybody can access. Two, we connect the entrepreneurs to financing. SME suffers from largely two challenges. One, access to opportunity. Two, access to finance. So we have closed that loop. They get opportunity and they get the financing. Third, what we do is we help with upskilling. We run workshops and seminars to train entrepreneurs on how to ensure that, one, there's no corruption, and two, how to run better businesses. And fourthly, finally, what we do is we offer a platform where business to business can work with each other. So what we are really doing is this. We're offering a business networking platform.
And the response, how's the response been to this here in South Africa? I wanted to ask you about the response within the context of what we've seen happen. We made the connection in the previous interview, you were watching it,
yes,
between tender irregularities and shoddy workmanship and loss of lives in the end.
Yes, I think the issue is actually transparency in the whole tender process. It actually starts with advertising the tender. You know, in most cases, you find out, you actually hear that people got work and you don't know where these tenders were advertised. You know, and the way the tenders have been advertised in the past is that people don't actually go to the papers. Now you pick up a paper on Sunday and the tender is closing on Monday. Now making the transparency to actually ensure that we lobby all government and private sector to ensure that there is at least one central place where all procurement opportunities can be listed. And I think that's actually a good start to make sure that there is transparency in the whole tender process.
The culture of business in South Africa, is that the problem? Are we in danger of becoming a business nation that pays backhanders, or that you have to get business in order, or that you have to pay a backhander in order to get a contract, for instance? Are we in danger of becoming a nation like that?
Certainly we are. Certainly we are. And that's why entrepreneurs themselves must guard against us. Because when you're an entrepreneur, and if you start paying backhands, what that does do is it hits within your own bottom line.
Yeah.
It affects your own capital. So government officials must do what they're supposed to do and not expect any specific backhand. Entrepreneurs as well must not encourage government officials by offering backhand in order for them to get an opportunity. And the one way of doing this is, yes, that there is a platform which is transparent, tenders are posted, and once the tender has been won by a specific entrepreneur, that as well is posted so that people know exactly who won it and for how much. And so if I had tendered at a lower price, I will know and be able to contest that. Why did so-and-so get it and I didn't get it? So transparency is key, and that is what we're bringing on board with opentenders.co.za.
Opentenders.co.za seems like a step in the right direction from where I'm sitting, because I know this process is in a mess in South Africa. All my friends in business they a little bit feel let down that this process has always seemed to be clandestine and under the table, as it were. Tell us about the launch, because it's only official launch this month. And then how do you see this grow and play out over the months to come?
Yes, actually, the website has been live, since the 1st of July, open to just a selective group of people, entrepreneurs that we worked with from a testing point of view. And the response has been great. And I think if you look at actually why we founded, we founded Open Tenders, is from our own pain. We've been entrepreneurs for quite some time. And if you look at the state-owned entities by themselves, there's over 600 of them, who procured over $1 trillion. Last year in terms of procurement, and that is actually a good market for small businesses. Now, to actually wake up every morning and try and find opportunities in all these entities, it is actually a nightmare. And when we put it out there, the response, from business people, whether small or big, has been great, because the system that actually like this didn't exist before. And you usually have to go and buy papers and never know when it's going to be advertised. It's really been cumbersome.
And how do you join the site?